Welcome to the Next Level Human podcast. As a human, you have a job to do. In fact, you have 4 jobs: to earn and manage money, to attain and maintain health and fitness, to build and sustain personal relationships, to find meaning and make a difference. None of these jobs are taught in school, and that is what this podcast is designed to do. To educate us all on living our most fulfilled lives through the mastery of these 4 jobs. I'm your host, Dr. Jade Teta, and I believe we are here living this life for 3 reasons and 3 reasons only: to learn, to teach, and to love. In this podcast, I will be learning, teaching, and loving right along with you. I'm grateful to have your company. Here's to our next level. Okay, what's going on, everyone? Welcome to today's show. Today, I am going to be doing an episode on how to coach nutrition. So if you're a nutritional coach or anyone who is doing this in practice, this is going to be very useful in terms of giving you insight into how I do this. And if you're somebody who is not in the profession, hopefully this is going to give you an idea of how to think about and coach yourself. Now, before we get into nutritional coaching, we need to cover a couple things that have been covered on the podcast before, but I want to make sure that this is a complete episode. So let's go through some of the basic things that kind of need to understand in terms of how to approach this. The first thing that we need to cover is what we do wrong or how we think wrongly about metabolism. One of the things that is most detrimental to people who are trying to make dietary changes specifically for fat loss is that if they're operating under the wrong understanding of how the human metabolism works, they obviously are going to be challenged in getting results. And so we really need to understand how metabolism works. It is not a simple calculator the way that most people think about it. And this has profound ramifications in terms of plateaus and dealing with hunger and cravings and all of these kinds of things. So the first thing we're going to go over is the 3 laws of metabolism. Now, if you go back earlier in this podcast, I think it was episode 3 or 4, I did an episode on the 5 laws of metabolism. I am oftentimes trying to simplify my frameworks and models to get them down to more organized and digestible parts. So I have turned that 5 laws of metabolism into 3. And so let's go into these 3 laws now. The first law is the law of metabolic flexibility. And this particular law essentially tells you how you want the metabolism to be functioning. The metabolism by its very nature is adaptable, it's reactive, it is flexible, and you want it to remain flexible. Think of it like a rubber band, right? Obviously, there's those little tiny thin rubber bands that get all dried and worn out. If you even try to pull them, they snap. We all know those types. And we also know those big rubber bands that you can pull every which way, and they never seem to break no matter how much pressure you put on them. That's how we want to be thinking about the metabolism. We want it to remain flexible and adaptive and reactive. We do not want it to become more rigid. Now, I know that this is different than the way most people think about it, because most people think they think between a fast metabolism and a slow metabolism. You do not want a fast metabolism. I say this all of the time, and it oftentimes throws people off. And here's why. A fast metabolism, trying to speed up the metabolism, almost always also speeds up hunger and cravings. This is why cold water therapy, which speeds up the metabolism, oftentimes does not end up in weight loss or fat loss, because people simply compensate with food. They end up eating more. This is why exercise has been shown to be an abysmal tool to lose body fat, because only about 25% of people respond to exercise with weight loss. The rest respond to exercise with increased hunger. And essentially, end up wiping out any deficit that they've created. This is why exercise has been shown repeatedly in studies on fat loss and weight loss to not be a very good strategy. It excels a little bit more when we talk about weight loss maintenance, but it's not a great tool when we talk about fat loss. And this is because of the way the metabolism works. Now, inside the law of metabolic flexibility, there's a couple things to understand. First is this idea of metabolic compensation. Whenever you eat less and or exercise more, in other words, whenever you create a very large calorie gap between intake of calories and output of calories, you put stress on the system. You make the system a little bit more rigid. You make the metabolism want to be in a position where it will recoup the lost calories. It wants to recoup the lost fuel. And so what we want to be careful about is this law of compensation. What happens when the metabolism starts to compensate? Well, if you eat less and exercise more, you'll get hungry. You'll get cravings. You'll have energy that is unpredictable and unstable. Hunger, energy, cravings, HEC or heck. When your heck goes out of check, you know that your metabolism is compensating and it's becoming more rigid. This idea of heck in check is something that I talk about over and over and over again. You always want to be looking at hunger, energy, and cravings. It's not that you won't have hunger and cravings. It's that you need to be in control of hunger and cravings. A flexible metabolism deals with shortages of food without going crazy with hunger and cravings and energy. It's able to tap into its fat stores and be flexible with the different fuels that it uses and tap into the fuel stored on its body. So metabolic compensation is definitely something to look into. Let's cover this a little bit more in depth. It's not just metabolic compensation. Now, when I say metabolic compensation, for those of you who are very savvy, you're probably thinking about adaptive thermogenesis, which is one small aspect of this. For those who don't know, adaptive thermogenesis is the term used in research on metabolism to denote the slowdown in resting energy expenditure or basal metabolic rate from dieting. This is called adaptive thermogenesis. The basal metabolic rate slows in response to dieting. Now, obviously, if you're going to lose weight, your basal metabolic rate will slow down because you're carrying less weight. But this adaptive thermogenesis occurs to a greater degree than what would be predicted with loss of body mass. So, for example, someone who diets to 180 pounds and someone who is currently at 180 pounds without dieting, the person who diets to 180 pounds will have a slower metabolic rate, a more rigid metabolism than the person who did not diet because of adaptive thermogenesis. But when I use the term metabolic compensation, I'm not just talking about adaptive thermogenesis. I'm also talking about this uptick in hunger and cravings. And I'm also talking about some of the constrained metabolic effects during exercise. For example, when the metabolism starts to compensate, you might do that 30-minute HIIT class and think you're burning 300 calories, but now the metabolism is compensating and it constrains the amount that you burn even during exercise. So not only does it decrease resting metabolic rate, it also constrains exercise-related calorie burn. It also decreases the motivation and the subconscious movements, the activities of daily living, something that research calls NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis. This will also naturally be decreased, and it ramps up hunger and cravings. All of this pointing to a more rigid metabolism. This is why when we get into this coaching model for nutrition, you have to understand that very rarely are you going to be successful coaching someone or you yourself if you're doing the same thing over and over and over again. In other words, there's nothing wrong with the eat less, exercise more model, except that coaches and individuals try to do this and this alone, day in and day out, week in and week out, month in and month out, year in and year out, when the metabolism is flexible and adapts and reacts. You do not use a continuous mechanism for an adaptable system. This is hugely important. So you need to understand metabolic compensation, and you need to be able to read the signs of metabolism to tell you when the metabolism is compensating. This is why HEC in check, hunger, energy, and cravings, HEC, is important. Or the sister term, SHMEC in check, SHMEC, sleep, hunger, mood, energy, and cravings. When HEC and SHMEC go out of check, you can tell that your metabolism is becoming more rigid. Okay? So let's get into the second law, the law of metabolic individuality. This essentially says that each human is unique. We have seen this. Physiologically, you are unique. Psychologically, you are unique. You're unique in your personal preferences. You're unique in your practical circumstances. I call these the 4 P's of metabolic individuality: physiology, psychology, personal preferences, and practical circumstances. Physiology, what do we mean by that? In one individual, maybe they can have oats or bread or something like that and get a very low insulin or blood sugar excursion. They can remain very sensitive to insulin. They don't get a lot of cortisol secretion with stress. And this is their physiological reality, partly based on genetics, partly based on their current conditioning, partly based on their lifestyle habits over time. But the fact remains that each of us have a different physiology. We react to foods differently. We react to stress differently, etc. We also have a different psychological sensitivities, a different personality. Some people react to stress and they get stressed and emotional. Other people are a little bit more stoic. Some people use food to soothe their stress. Some people use exercise to soothe their stress. Everyone's a little bit different psychologically. We're also different in our personal preferences. Some people like wine. Some people like Brussels sprouts. Some people like sweet. Some people like sour. Some people like savory. Some people like bitter. Some people like chocolate. Some people do not. We have to adhere to this. And then we all have different practical circumstances. Some people have access to places like Whole Foods and the ability to buy whole foods and organic foods and free-range beef and stuff like that. And some people don't. Some people's reality is that they're shopping mainly at ExxonMobil stations and don't have the ability to, essentially have access to great food. So we all need to be aware of this. Some people's living conditions are all about different individuals. Some people are raising children. Some people are living by themselves. Some people have a very stressful work environment. Some people don't. So when we're talking about metabolic individuality, you need to always honor this in your client and in yourself. Understanding slowly, you'll learn over time, your physiology, your psychology, always paying attention to your personal preferences. How well are you going to attain or maintain a diet, rather, if you love chocolate and you're never allowed to have chocolate? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, does it? So we have to look after the individuality. And finally, the third law is the law of psychic entropy. Psychic meaning brain, entropy meaning loss, right? Loss of energy. So this is basically losing energy in the brain. This is speaks to willpower and this idea that if you are always self-editing, always obsessing, always counting, always paying close attention, and that's what we mean by self-editing, always checking in, that if you're under stress, if you're sleep deprived, what ends up happening is the more you try to use willpower, this takes some energy. Any type of self-editing, keeping a schedule, managing a schedule, talking to people, reading, learning, all of these things can lower brain power and make willpower less of an aspect to tap into. In fact, we really shouldn't even call it willpower. We really should talk about it as skill power, because willpower is something that can be drained or charged up. And learning the right habits and the right way of approaching this idea of willpower can actually bolster and grow your willpower battery. And so these 3 aspects of metabolism are key to understand: the law of metabolic flexibility, the law of metabolic individuality, and the law of psychic entropy. These things you need to be very clear on, because as you go along in coaching, giving a program to someone and following up with them over time, these are going to become important. You need to adhere to these different aspects and pay attention to these different aspects. Now, the next thing we need to cover is a key model that I use to describe metabolism to my clients. And this is the 4M model of metabolism. This is sort of the last sort of framework that you need before we get into how to do this coaching. The 4M model. Here's the interesting thing about the way most people think about metabolism. They think it really has to do with two things: what they eat and how they exercise. The truth is that metabolism is really about four things. I call them the 4 M's of metabolism. The first M is mindfulness and mindset. The thing that you need to understand about metabolism is that it is very much like one big stress barometer. Now, if you could picture a pressure barometer and the pressure building up on it and it going into the red, and the pressure continues to build until it basically shatters, this is what you want to be thinking about with the metabolism. When you are under stress, you are building up pressure in the system. And when pressure builds up in this system, the metabolism sends signals around the body that says, don't burn fat, save our resources. We are in a stressful time and we're going to need them. In other words, anytime you're under increased stress, whether it's being stuck in traffic, a deadline at work, an argument with your significant other, any of this kind of stuff, the metabolism has an ancient software program that it institutes when it deals with stress, because the major stress that the metabolism was dealing with for millennia as it was evolving in different species and then in Homo sapiens was what? The starvation response. And so when you are under too much stress, your body is going to kick in the starvation response. What's that look like? Well, it looks a lot like metabolic compensation we talked about before. Increased hunger, unpredictable, unstable energy, increased cravings, slow down in basal metabolic rate, reduced rate of activities of daily living, constraining the metabolism when you exercise. This is what it does. Now, if you want to take stress off the system, you have to do things that do that. And unfortunately, diet and exercise, especially if they're overdone, are an increased stress to the system. Many people think that dieting and exercise are going to decrease the stress on the metabolism. The truth is, any large gap between intake and output, whether you're eating less and exercising more, or whether you're eating more and exercising less, create a stress to this stress barometer. And so we need something other than just diet and exercise, which we'll get to in a minute, to help take the stress off the system and decrease the starvation response. This means we really want to institute all kinds of things that lower cortisol. This could be exposure to green settings. Being out in the woods has been shown to lower cortisol. Hanging out in saunas and contrast hydrotherapy. These things will raise stress hormones in the short term, but then see a suppression and a relaxation of the stress hormone response after that. You can use saunas, you can use hot baths. It's better if you do contrast, going back and forth from hot and cold. Meditation, massage, even self-massage, like things like melt and things like foam rolling and self-myofascial release. Meditation, massage, naps, and sleep are huge. Sex and physical affection are a big one. Orgasm is one of the things that people don't like to talk about, but orgasm is certainly one of the things that we have as humans that can completely reset our stress system. Time with pets is another one, as long as they're not peeing and pooping all over the floor. There are many different things here. Creative pursuits are one that a lot of people don't think about: painting, playing a musical instrument, that kind of thing. And so you want to be thinking, how often am I doing these things? Like, what am I doing mindfulness-wise and mindset-wise to make sure I'm taking stress off of the system? By the way, walking, which we'll talk about here in a minute, is also one of the best ways for mindfulness training. So the first M is mindfulness, doing all these things that lower stress hormones. I call these rest and recovery activities. The second one is movement. Now, people might say, well, Jade, isn't movement just exercise? Not exactly. Exercise is a structured movement with a very defined goal. What we're talking about here is just activities of daily living. If you watch hunter-gatherers and you watch people living in natural settings, they are moving all of the time. They have to walk to get from point A to point B. People often say we're born to run. We're not born to run. We're born to walk. So we've seen in research that people who sit don't fare very well. In fact, in terms of health outcomes and weight loss, between two types of individuals, you would rather be the type that moves all day and doesn't exercise at all versus the type that sits all day and then goes and does a 30-minute workout. You want to have a base of movement. So the first two M's of metabolism are mindset and mindfulness, and movement. And isn't it funny that walking straddles both of these? Walking actually helps with the mindfulness component, and it helps with the movement component. And when we talk about walking, especially for stress reduction, we're talking about slow, leisurely, or leisurely walking. This is not power walking. This is walking smelling the roses. This is walking the dog. This is walking drinking some coffee. This is walking having a conversation with your significant other. This is just slow, rhythmic walking. It's one of the only things that lowers stress hormones and sensitizes the body to insulin at the same time. Also, by the way, you can use things like yoga and Tai Chi in the mindfulness component of metabolism, but they also need to be very gentle. Power yoga, Bikram yoga, hot yoga, these kinds of things that are very intense are not going to do it. You're going to want to be doing very yin yoga and very rhythmic type of Tai Chi. Now you can get into the second two M's, which is what everyone's used to. Meals and metabolics. Meals being what you eat, and metabolics being how you stimulate the metabolism. Metabolics includes exercise. It also includes supplements and drugs. The trick with meals and metabolics that we'll get in here in a minute is you do not want too much. You also do not want too little. You want the Goldilocks zone. If you're going to use diet and exercise to reduce stress, you do not want it to be too much or too little. You want it just right. Not too much, not too little, but just right. The Goldilocks zone. That is true of calories. You want enough, but not too much. And exercise. You want enough, but not too much. Otherwise, you start to add stress to that stress barometer. Now, why would I be going through this 4M model as well? Because when you go through the coaching, which you're going to start here in just a minute, what you're going to do is you want to grade the person you're working with or yourself on each of these 4Ms. Give them anywhere from a grade from an A to an F. And you really want people scoring well in these. And if you see someone who's got, let's say, an A in diet and an A in metabolics, in other words, in the meals they're scoring an A, and in the metabolics they're scoring an A, but you see an F in mindfulness and a D in movement, you know exactly why they're not getting results. Because let's face it, most people are only doing 50% of what is required. You need all 4Ms to get the results. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Now, how do we start with this process? Once you understand and you have the right framework, and by the way, if you want more details on what I'm talking about here, you can go back to episode 11 and episode 12 and probably episode 24. This will give you a little bit more background on some of the advanced aspects of working with the different laws of metabolism. When I start coaching someone, essentially I start by telling them, just walk me through your day. From the time you wake up in the morning, I want to know what time they wake up, and I want to know everything they do throughout their day, paying particular attention to the different 4Ms. What are they doing mindfulness and mindset-wise? Are they moving? What are they doing meal-wise? And what are they doing metabolics-wise? And I'm also looking at trying to pick up clues about their unique physiology, their unique psychology, their personal preferences, and their practical circumstances. So as they walk me through their day, I will ask questions about, so what do you typically have for breakfast? Give me your typical breakfast. How does that make you feel? Are you satisfied with that? Or are you hungry all day? Do you get cravings? When are you naturally hungry? When aren't you? When do you get cravings? When don't you? Is your energy relatively stable? I'm looking for all these things. I want to know what they're doing, and I want to know how their metabolism is reacting to what they are doing. And so I'm paying very close attention to the 4M model, giving them a grade, and I'm also paying very close attention to get clues about their psychology, their physiology, their personal preferences, and their practical circumstances. And from there, I begin filling in the gaps there. Now, the other thing that I'll say here is that really what ends up happening is you want to be very careful with just giving people off-the-shelf protocols. Now, we all, as nutritionists and coaches, we all have these off-the-shelf protocols, and we all have our own biases. Some people like giving mainly plant-based diets. Some people like working in the keto space. Other people like doing different things. For me, I am program agnostic because, go back to the law of metabolic individuality. If each person is an individual, then we will find that vegan and vegetarian diets may work for some and be abysmal for others. Keto diets and low-carb diets may work for some and be abysmal for others. The paleo diet may be great for one person and horrible for another. And so we have to look at our clients, and oftentimes our clients will come into us having an idea about what they want to do. And so I'm always interested in that, because it does not matter what structure we start with. And this is the concept of structured flexibility. Once I bring someone through their day, their 24-hour period, I'm going to have an idea about where I want to go, but I'll also get an idea about where they want to go. For example, maybe they've heard about intermittent fasting or keto diets and they are really gung-ho to try that. For me, I am fine in any direction they want to go, because what we now understand about metabolism is the structure is less important than the flexibility. In other words, we can give someone a structured diet, but we know based on the law of metabolic individuality that that's going to have to be flexible, and eventually we're going to have to help them find their own diet, the diet that works for them. And we're going to have to put our biases and our dogma and our need to do what we think works for us or has worked for other clients away when we're dealing with this particular person. Now, you might ask, well, Jade, let's say they don't come in with a particular affinity for a diet like the keto diet or a vegetarian diet. Then where would you start them? For me, very simply, I use the 5S diet, which is basically soups, salads, scrambles, shakes, and stir fries. In fact, low carb, low fat soups, salads, scrambles, shakes, and stir fries. And the reason why is that based on the research, we know that we want a low calorie diet, a nutrient dense diet, and a hunger suppressing diet. Well, foods that are rich in protein, fiber, and water, which include lean meats and basically salads, so basically meat and salad, are the best for that in terms of nutrient density, low calorie, and hunger suppression, which is really what we're trying to achieve. And so low carb, low fat, soup, salad, scrambled shakes, and stir fries, 90% of those foods, and then 10% with an addition of starch, fat, sugar, alcohol to make salt, to make the diet enjoyable. And so now what ends up happening is I've gone through a day in a life. I now pick a structure for the diet, whether it's something they chose themselves that we're going to try or something that I gave them, like the soup, salad, scrambled shakes, and stir fries approach, right? So now I'm sitting there. I've gone through the entire day. I've given them grades in each of the 4M categories. So I know that some of my, the lowest grade, if they get the lowest grade in mindfulness, which they oftentimes do, I know I'm going to be spending a lot of time dealing with stress-reducing activities in terms of some of my recommendations. Then I'm going to go into making sure they have a base of movement. Then I'm going to be focusing on the meal aspect. And very rarely do I give people a bunch of exercise to do in the beginning, especially if they're deconditioned. In fact, I oftentimes leave the metabolics for later. I almost always start with mindfulness and movement first, and then the diet, and the exercise component comes in later, unless they're already exercising, in which case we leave it exactly as it is. And so this is a hint to what happens. Now, at this point, I'm going to discuss with them the fact that the structure means very little. The diet itself, the actual diet that I'm handing them, that we have discussed, means very little compared to how their body reacts. And so I teach them a little bit about the language of metabolism. The metabolism does not speak English, it speaks metabolism. We need to teach our clients how to speak metabolism. How do we do that? We teach them about HEC and SHMEC and how to assess fat loss. And so what I'm talking to them about at this point is saying, here is the diet you're going to follow, whether it's a keto diet, a paleo diet, or whatever. This is the easy part. Here's the structure. Yet we're going to need to be flexible. And in order to be flexible, we need to understand if this is working for your metabolism or not. A diet that works keeps your HEC and SHMEC in check and causes you to lose fat. If we get that result, we are very, very happy, and we're going to ride that result until that result no longer is the case, because we know that the metabolism is going to change. So let's go through the different scenarios. And what happens is they will come back a week later, and at this point, I start talking to them and say, okay, how was your hunger, energy, and cravings? How was your sleep, your hunger, your mood, your energy, and cravings? And did you lose fat or not? And by the way, the easiest way to assess fat, especially when you're working with clients online, which is what I do mostly now, which a lot of us are doing now given COVID, is simply to have people weigh themselves and do a waist measurement. This is the easiest way to do this. If they're losing weight and their inches are going down in their waist, this is fantastic. If they're not losing weight and their inches are going down in their waist, this is also fantastic. The waist is a really nice area to assess fat loss because it's not a very heavily muscled area. This is an area that we can see fat loss come down. So we want to look at the weight on a scale and the actual waist measurement. Now, if you're using body composition, that's fantastic. You just don't really want to use weight by itself. You want a measure of fat loss. Weight plus circumference measurements is the best. And so now they come back and say, is heck in check or not? Yes or no? Have I lost fat or not? Yes or no? And by the way, if someone gains a little bit of weight or stays the same, but their inches go down, what happened? That means they gained some muscle and lost some fat, right? And so really the most important fat loss measurement is the waist measurement. This is really what we want to be looking at, is the waist measurement going down. Now, at this point, there's going to be several different scenarios. Scenario one is heck is in check and they're losing fat. This is fantastic. Now, a lot of people will want to try to speed up that result. Do not make that mistake. Remember, the metabolism works in a Goldilocks zone. If you try to speed it up, you might just slip right out of that state. So if heck is in check and they're losing fat, keep doing exactly the same thing. Now, if heck is in check and they're not losing fat, this is a good result as well because at least they're in a position of strength. They're not chasing hunger and cravings all over the place. So at this point, you can have them do a diet recall. You can have them start tracking their calories in MyFitnessPal, or you can just decrease calories either by decreasing carbs and or fat or just calories in general. But the fact that heck is in check means that you can push on the metabolism a little bit. So you see why you want both of these. By the way, hunger, energy, and cravings, heck and schmeck being in check is a measure of hormonal metabolism. It's a measure of hormone balance. The fat loss is a measure of calorie reduction. We want both. There's two things required for fat loss: hormonal balance and a caloric deficit. If heck is in check, we know the hormones are stable and balanced. If they're losing fat, especially around the waist, we know that they've achieved the calorie deficit. We don't need to do anything else at that point. Now, what happens if their heck is not in check and they're losing fat? This is the dieter's dilemma, right? This is every single dieter. I call this the metabolic credit card effect because what we know is going to happen is they're going to lose weight for a time, and then what? The metabolism is going to compensate, and it's going to compensate hard, and they're going to regain that weight, usually because of all the things we talked about before at the beginning of this podcast. This is why it's called the metabolic credit card effect. And almost everyone who does the traditional eat less, exercise more approach ends up gaining the weight back. In fact, 95% of people gain the weight back inside of a year, and 66% end up fatter. At 2 years, that goes to about 98%. At 3 years, almost 100%. 99.9% of people gain that weight back or end up fatter. This is why we need to do this a better way. Part of the reason this happens is because people keep doing the eat less, exercise more approach instead of using some of the approaches that I'm going to talk to you about here, and also are not paying attention to the hormonal heck and check process either. And so this is where you want to do everything you can to get heck back in check. Well, how do you do that without raising calories? We just talked about it a little while ago. Soup, salad, scrambled shakes, and stir fries. In fact, low carb, low fat soup, salad, scrambled shakes, and stir fries. Oftentimes when you add more fiber, more protein, and more water, it displaces other calories and the person starts to eat less naturally. If that is not the case, right, then you can begin to look at MyFitnessPal and other measures of looking at diet recall. One hint here with this is that people oftentimes eat very clean during the week, and then on the weekend they'll have these highly palatable foods, these cheat meals or these refeeds like burgers and pizza and things like that. Well, for many people, these highly palatable hedonistic foods ping the craving centers in the brain, making you want more of those foods. This is why a cheat meal oftentimes turns into a cheat week or a cheat month for people. So what you want to be careful about is you want to make sure this is not happening, because oftentimes people's heck and schmeck are going out of check, largely because they are then having these highly palatable meals and then can't stay on the program. So make sure you look at that as well. And so what you're doing at this point is you're giving your recommendations to these individuals based on the 4Ms. I want you to do these mindfulness activities. I want you walking 10,000 to 20,000 steps per day. I want you to eat this 5S diet, soup, salad, scrambled shakes, and stir fries. I either want you not to exercise or just continue to do what you're doing. And then week after week, we check and see, is heck in check? Are you losing fat? Now, what happens if heck is out of check and they're not losing fat or they're gaining fat? This is oftentimes a compliance issue, and this means you're going to have to go backwards. And don't blame the client, blame yourself. It probably means you gave them a program that they could not do, and therefore you need to change this around and do this differently and make it more easy for them. The idea of helping people change is that you want to create a diet and a lifestyle within inside the 4M framework that is as easy or easier than what they were doing prior, and as enjoyable or more enjoyable than what they were doing prior. If you can do that, if you can come up with a plan based on this 4M framework that is easy and enjoyable for people, they will see amazing results with this. So I'm going to wrap up this particular podcast by telling you one of my first clients' stories that hopefully will draw all this together. This client was a long-haul trucker. His name was Dale. His wife sent him to me, and he was not happy to be there. He's looking at me like I'm a witch doctor, basically a naturopathic physician. His wife is all into natural medicine and natural foods and all this, but he could care less about this stuff. So he's a little annoyed that he's there. Now, as I began to take his daily recall, here's what he's telling me. He's basically on the road constantly. He eats wherever his truck stops. He's eating oftentimes out of ExxonMobil stations, things like Coca-Cola, chips, Snickers bars. These are kind of his favorites. He eats at greasy spoons and fast food places. He doesn't do any exercise. He's sitting in his truck constantly. And this is how he likes to live his life. Now, he's also 30 pounds overweight, diabetic, on metformin, and that's one of the reasons he is sitting in front of me. Now, right away, at this time in my career, if you would ask me, I was very biased and dogmatic about he needs to be on whole foods and he needs to be cooking all his meals and all of this kind of stuff. But I knew in that moment there's no way, based on his, psychology and personal preferences and practical circumstances, am I going to be able to give him, wild-caught salmon and organic kale to eat. I had to work with what he would do. And so I started basically asking him, based on his physiology actually too, what did I know about his physiology? Well, I know he's diabetic. I know his major issue is not being able to control sugars, and that the most important thing we can do with a diabetic is take out the carbohydrates and sugars if we're going to help him. So I understood his physiology. I also understood his psychology. He did not want to be there. He was annoyed. He needed something easy. And I understood his personal preferences, where he liked to eat, and his practical circumstances. He was driving around in a truck. And so now I look across his 4Ms and I see he's not doing anything mindfulness related. He's certainly not doing anything movement related. He's not doing anything metabolics related. And his meals are absolutely horrible, right? So when I looked at that as well and then went back to his psychology and personal preferences and practical circumstances, I thought the only thing I'm going to be able to do is work with his nutrition right off the bat. And so the first thing I did is I said, at these ExxonMobil stations, can you, instead of getting a Snickers bar, get nuts like almonds, peanuts, and things like that, or even just a protein bar? He said he would try. I said, can you move to Diet Coke instead of regular Coke? He said he would try, which is all I really wanted. I said, can you also, instead of getting chips and things like that, can you use nuts or Slim Jims or beef jerkies and all this kind of stuff? You can see what I'm doing based on his physiology. I'm trying to get all of the sugars out and give him more protein and fat instead. This is a guy, he's a big eater. We need to control hunger. We also need to take out these, sweets, the Coca-Cola, the Snickers bars, the chips. This is all carbohydrate and fat, right? So I know I needed to get some protein on board, keep the fat in to satiate him, but try to get the sugars out. He said he would try. I also had him at his fast food places. I asked him if he could strip off the buns to the biscuits and the burgers and the sandwiches and things like that. He told me that he would try to do that. And I said, stick to water or diet soda. Don't do regular soda. I also told him to, when he stops at rest areas and stuff like that, to do a few push-ups. He used to be an old football player back in his high school days, but I said, can you just set your alarm for 1 minute, your mobile device or whatever, and do 1 minute of push-ups or 1 minute of squats or this kind of thing at each stop. He said he would try. That's all I could ask for. Of course, at that time, I thought I gave him poison. The idea that I would ever tell people to have Diet Coke and, Slim Jims and stuff like that, I thought for sure I would never see this guy again. About 3 months later, he comes back in the office, and I barely even recognized him. He lost about 30 pounds. He sat down with me. He did everything that I told him to do. He told me that it was easy. He had lost close to 30 pounds. His doctor took him off his metformin. Now, at this point in time, I was doing a consulting practice, so I was not his physician. I was in North Carolina. I wasn't licensed in North Carolina. But his physician was ecstatic that he had lost so much weight, and they took him off his metformin because he was essentially not a diabetic anymore. Now, think about that for a minute. Diet soda, nitrates and nitrite-loaded beef sticks, right? Glorified candy bars in the form of protein shakes, Diet Coke, all these things. I never in a million years as a naturopathic physician would have dreamed of giving anyone this particular prescription. However, it's what worked for him in terms of his 4Ms and his practical circumstances and preferences at that time. And so I'm using him to guide me rather than trying to fit him into a particular mold. And the results were absolutely astounding. And here's what's really interesting about this is that he told me too in that visit, he goes, it's been so motivating that I've actually, when I'm home, I've started walking with my wife and I'm eating a little bit more vegetables, and she's even starting to pack some foods for me for some of my trips. So the fact that he got results is what made him interested in going further. This illustrates that when we are coaching ourselves or other people, we need to create a structure that is doable. And then we also need to be flexible in our adjustments. Now, in this particular case, I didn't follow up with him until 3 months later. However, if I was following up with him, I would have been adjusting things based on his responses, keeping heck in check and looking for that fat loss. So I've been rambling on a while. I'm going to go ahead and end here, but let's just summarize what we're talking about here. When you're coaching, the first thing you need to understand is the 3 laws of metabolism. Understand how the metabolism works, understand this is an individual, and understand willpower is more like skill power. It's going to take time. Then you're going to have this 4M model, mindset and mindfulness, movement, meals, and metabolics. You want to grade the person after going through a day in the life. And oftentimes what I'll do, just to if I have enough time, I'll oftentimes do a day in the life and then a great day and then a shitty day. Or a day when they're traveling, especially a lot of the clients I work with are high-end, CEOs and entrepreneurs, and they move around a lot. So some days they're traveling. And so I'll oftentimes give a structure a day of a certain diet for when they're traveling and a certain diet for when they're at home and they have more structure. Then we're following up every single week and we're essentially saying, what is your hunger, energy, and cravings doing, and are you losing fat? And then we're adjusting, realizing that we're always adjusting with food, not exercise. And realizing that our number one goal is first to get heck in check so that whatever we do is sustainable. Once heck is in check, we then can push on the metabolism by lowering calories, lowering carbs, decreasing the fuel reserve. So the holy grail of this is heck in check, hormones balanced, hunger, energy, cravings under control, and fat loss. If we're not getting that, then we adjust and we tweak, mainly using things like protein, fiber, and water to control hunger, using small amounts, just the right amount of salt, sugar, alcohol, and starch and fat to satisfy and help with cravings, being very careful not to overdo those things, but oftentimes flavor is important for your nutrition. And one of the final things I'll say here is the idea between buffer and trigger foods. We want people to have foods that they like that help them eat better. That would be a buffer food. We also want people to avoid foods that they like that make them eat worse. Now, this is another thing where you got to check your bias, because for some people, wine is a buffer food. For other people, it's a trigger food. For some people, chocolate is a buffer food. For other people, it's a trigger food. If wine is a buffer food and helps people eat less and healthier at dinner, then you definitely want wine in this person's program. If wine is a trigger food and makes them drink more wine, makes them overeat dinner, and makes them want sweets later, then you want to take wine out. But you want as many buffer foods as you can possibly get. And remember, a buffer food is not necessarily a food that you think is healthy or not. It's a food that's healthy for them. It's a food that no matter how healthy or unhealthy it is, looking at it in isolation, when it's included in the diet, it helps people eat less and better quality foods. So buffer and trigger foods are huge here. And then you essentially rework this system again and again and again. Every week they come back. Heck and check, fat loss. If yes, keep going. If not, we adjust. Heck and check, fat loss. If yes, we keep going. If not, we adjust. And what happens is slowly but surely, that structure that you started with morphs into the perfect diet and lifestyle for this particular individual or for you. And this is the way it works. So in a sense, yes, this is trial and error. Yes, though, it's done in a very structured way. All right, I'm going to end there. A couple things I want to just mention real quick. Check out the sponsors to the show, Paleo Valley. These are those fermented beef sticks that I love so much. PaleoValley.com. Use the code NEXTLEVEL and you can get these beef sticks at a discount. They get the sale. You get a little bit of a discount. I get a kickback as well, full disclosure, and it's a win-win-win for all of us. So check out Paleo Valley. Also check out Cured Nutrition. Cured Nutrition is the CBD company that I use. I use them to help me sleep. The product Zen is the one that I use every single night before I go to bed, just about every single night. It helps me sleep better. I am notoriously difficult with my sleep. They also have other products like Rise to help energy during the day. And they also have a muscle rub that I use as well. But go check them out, Cured Nutrition. And also, same code, Next Level. That'll give you a discount as well. So check out Paleo Valley and Cured Nutrition. Please do me a favor, hit me up on the DMs. Let me know any shows you want me to cover. And I would love for you to go over to iTunes and give me a review. I always love seeing those reviews and getting your feedback. Thanks so much for being here, and I will see you all at the next show.